Welcome to Lights Out Stories. New stories drop every week. If you want to be here when they do, hit subscribe and settle in. Tonight's story is called The Vault. It's about a group of engineers and scientists who drilled a tunnel into the side of an Arctic mountain and built the most important room in the world, a place designed to outlast civilization itself, holding the seeds of every crop humanity has ever grown, so that if the worst ever happens, the world can start again. So get comfortable, turn the lights down, and let's get into it. There is a mountain on an island at the top of the world. The island is called Spitsbergen. It sits in the Svalbard archipelago, roughly 1,000 miles from the North Pole, in a place where the sun does not rise for 4 months of the year and does not set for another 4. In the winter, the temperature falls to -20, -30. The wind comes off the Arctic Ocean with nothing to slow it down for hundreds of miles. Polar bears outnumber people. The nearest city of any size is several hours away by plane, and the plane does not always fly. Into the side of this mountain, in the year 2008, a group of engineers drilled a tunnel 130 meters deep into ancient sandstone and built a room. The room is kept at -18 degrees Celsius. In the room are seeds. Not a few seeds, not a collection. As of today, more than 1,300,000 individual seed samples, representing nearly every food crop humanity has ever cultivated. Wheat from Ethiopia, rice from the Philippines, corn varieties that have not been grown commercially in 100 years, vegetables, legumes, grains, and fruits from countries that in some cases no longer exist in the same form they did when they made their deposits. The room is called the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. Most people call it the DoomsDay Vault. The engineers who built it prefer a different name. They call it the Backup. Eric Halverson was 46 years old when he was asked to help design it. He had spent his career building things in difficult places. Not the glamorous difficult, not the towers in Dubai, or the bridges in cities that appear on magazine covers. The other kind of difficult. Tunnels through Norwegian mountain ranges, where the geology changed every 50 meters. Infrastructure in the far north, where the ground itself was a variable. Facilities in places where the weather was not a backdrop to the work, but an active participant in it, making decisions of its own that the engineers had to anticipate and accommodate, and sometimes simply survive. He had a reputation for this, for solving problems that involved cold and pressure, and time in unusual combination, for asking the right questions about what a structure had to do, not just this year, but in 100 years, in 500 years. The question he was asked, in an office in Oslo in the early months of 2006, was this: what would it take to build a facility on Svalbard that could reliably preserve seeds for 1,000 years? He wrote down the question. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, "Tell me more about the seeds the idea had been building for decades. Since the middle of the 20th century, plant geneticists had understood something that most people outside their field did not think about. The world's food supply rested on a narrower genetic foundation than it appeared to. Modern agriculture had achieved extraordinary productivity through the development of high-yield crop varieties, plants optimized for output, for disease resistance, for the specific conditions of large-scale industrial farming. The result was more food per acre than any previous generation had been able to produce. The cost was diversity. When a farmer plants a field of a single high-yield wheat variety, that field is genetically identical from one end to the other. Every plant faces the same diseases the same way. Every plant responds to drought or flood or temperature change the same way. The efficiency of uniformity is also its vulnerability. The old varieties, the landrace varieties that farmers had cultivated for thousands of years in specific regions, adapted to specific conditions, carrying within them traits that had been selected by centuries of use, were disappearing, not all at once, quietly, one farm at a time, as older farmers retired and younger ones planted what the market demanded. A wheat variety that had fed a mountain village in Turkey for 4 centuries went out of cultivation because there was no market for it. The knowledge of how to grow it went with the farmers who grew it. The seeds themselves went last, stored in a barn, then forgotten, then lost. No one noticed any single loss. The cumulative loss was enormous. Geneticists had been sounding the alarm since the 1970s. Gene banks had been established in countries around the world. Collections of seeds stored in controlled conditions, maintained by institutions that were doing their best with limited resources. There were roughly 1,700 gene banks globally. They were fragile. They depended on electricity, on funding that was subject to the political cycles of their host countries, on institutions that could be disrupted by conflict, by natural disaster, by the simple organizational entropy that affects everything humans build. In 1979, a gene bank in the Philippines was damaged by a typhoon. In 1981, a gene bank in Afghanistan was destroyed during the Soviet invasion. In 2003, a gene bank in Iraq was looted. In 2015, a gene bank in Syria, one of the most important collections in the world for Near Eastern crop varieties, had to be evacuated as the civil war reached its location. What the world needed was not another gene bank. What the world needed was a backup for all of them. A place so remote, so stable, so specifically chosen that the things held within it could outlast anything that might happen to the institutions and nations that had deposited them. Eric listened to all of this. He asked his questions. Then he went home and looked at maps of Svalbard for a long time. The site selection was the first problem. The mountain had to meet several requirements that were, individually, not unusual, and that together were nearly impossible. The permafrost had to be continuous and stable. The natural freezing of the ground was the most important backup system in the design. If the mechanical cooling failed, the permafrost would maintain the temperature on its own for months, perhaps years. Continuous permafrost extended reliably at Svalbard, but not everywhere on the island equally. It had to be checked. The mountain had to be high enough above sea level that even dramatic predictions for sea level rise. And Eric was asked to design for projections extending 200 years into the future, would not threaten the facility. The vault entrance sits approximately 130 meters above current sea level. The geology had to be stable, no significant fault lines, no history of unusual seismic activity. The sandstone of the Svalbard Mountains is ancient and dense, formed roughly 400 million years ago, and not inclined to change its opinions about itself. There had to be no groundwater intrusion. A facility cut into a mountain on an Arctic island faced the risk of meltwater from above and below during the brief warming of the short summer. The drainage had to be understood and managed, and there had to be access. Not easy access. The remoteness was a feature, not a problem, but access sufficient for construction equipment and for the ongoing deliveries of seeds that would continue indefinitely. Eric spent 3 months on Svalbard before he finalized the site recommendation. He walked in conditions that required 3 layers under his outer shell, and where the wind made note-taking a project in itself. He drilled test cores into the mountain and had them analyzed. He talked to the Norwegian researchers who had been working on the island for decades and who knew its specific geology, the way you only know a place after years of close attention. He found the site in the autumn of 2006, a slope of the Plateauberget mountain facing slightly north, at an elevation that satisfied every requirement. The permafrost here was cold and stable. The sandstone was intact. There was no groundwater risk at the depth they planned to build. He wrote his recommendation. Construction began the following year. Building on Svalbard in winter is not like building anywhere else. The darkness is total from late October through mid-February. The workers wore headlamps at noon. The equipment had to be specially prepared for extreme cold. Hydraulic fluids that would freeze at normal Arctic temperatures had to be replaced with formulations designed for -30 and below. Metal that would become brittle in the cold had to be identified and substituted. Every morning began with an assessment of conditions that in more temperate environments would not have been necessary. The tunnel was bored by a roadheader, a machine that cuts through rock using a rotating drum fitted with cutting tools. Operated by men who worked in shifts around the clock to maintain progress during the brief window when the project could move forward efficiently. The tunnel goes straight into the mountain at a slight upward angle. The upward angle is intentional. It means that any water that enters the tunnel drains out rather than pooling at the vault end. This is the kind of detail that separates the engineers who have built things in wet and cold environments from those who have not. The angle is small, barely perceptible when you walk through it. The effect is permanent. At the end of the tunnel, 3 chambers were excavated. The central chamber is the largest, roughly 27 meters long, 9 meters wide, and 5 meters high. It is lined with rock bolts and steel mesh, and insulated panels that maintain the -18 degrees Celsius required to preserve the seeds. The door at the tunnel entrance is steel. It is not a dramatic door. It is not built to look significant. It looks like what it is. A functional door, designed to seal the tunnel against whatever comes. Eric stood at the door on the day it was installed and thought about what it was sealing in. Not just seeds, not just genetic material in foil packets, in sealed boxes on metal racks, in a cold room in a mountain, on an island at the top of the world. The accumulated agricultural knowledge of 12,000 years of human civilization. Every time a family in Peru had selected the best potato plants from their harvest to save seed for next year, for generation after generation, until the variety was perfectly adapted to the altitude and soil and rainfall of that specific valley. That process was in the vault. Every time a farmer in Ethiopia had kept back a handful of grain from a drought year because the plants that survived had something the others didn't, that observation was in the vault. Every breeding decision made by farmers who had no degrees and no laboratories and no instruments except their own eyes and the long accumulated knowledge of their communities, that was in the vault. He stood at the door for a long time. The first seeds arrived in February of 2008. From Norway, from Sweden, from the United States, from Canada, from Kenya, from South Korea, from countries whose governments had decided that their agricultural heritage was worth preserving in a place more permanent than any institution they could build themselves. The packages came in insulated boxes. Each sample was sealed in a foil pouch, the moisture removed to prevent ice crystal formation that would damage the seed. The pouches were labeled, catalogued, placed in sealed containers, and moved into the vault on metal shelving that ran the length of the chamber. Eric was there for the first delivery. He watched the boxes being carried through the tunnel. He thought about the farmers who had grown the plants that produced the seeds in those packages. Most of them he would never know. Most of them did not know about the vault. The connection between them and this moment in a tunnel on a Norwegian island in the Arctic winter was long and indirect and completely real. He went back to Oslo that evening. He slept better than he had in months. The test came in 2016, an unusually warm autumn, warm in the specific, unsettling way that had become more common. Temperatures on Svalbard rising faster than almost anywhere else on Earth caused unexpected meltwater to intrude into the outer tunnel. Not into the vault itself. The seeds were never at risk. The drainage angle Eric had built into the tunnel design did exactly what it was meant to do, moving the water away from the vault chambers and toward the entrance. But the water froze as it moved through the cooler inner sections of the tunnel, creating an ice formation that was striking and strange, and that generated, when photographs reached the international press, a wave of alarmed headlines. The DoomsDay vault was flooded. The end of the world's backup plan had itself flooded. Eric read the headlines with the particular weariness of an engineer watching the gap between what happened and what was reported about what happened. The tunnel had performed exactly as designed. The water had intruded into the tunnel entrance, an area outside the main vault, and the drainage system had moved it out. The permafrost in the tunnel had temporarily thawed slightly in an area near the entrance due to the unusual warmth, which was not a design failure, but a data point about changing conditions that needed to be addressed. He addressed it. Over the following 2 years, waterproofing improvements were made to the tunnel entrance. A pumping system was installed to remove any future intrusion before it could freeze and accumulate. The drainage system was verified and extended. The vault continued to operate without interruption throughout. He was not complacent about what the 2016 event meant. The Arctic was warming at a rate that exceeded the projections the original design had incorporated. The permafrost, that was the vault's primary backup cooling system, was under more stress than the early models had suggested. This was not a reason to abandon the design. It was a reason to extend it. To think again about what the next 100 years of climate projections suggested, and what additional measures those projections required. Eric spent 2 years on this analysis. The conclusions were incorporated into the ongoing operational plan. This is what engineering is, when it is done correctly. Not a fixed answer, a sustained conversation with a changing problem. By the early 2020s, the vault held seeds from nearly every country on Earth, including, in one of the quiet diplomatic achievements that the vault had made possible, seed samples from nations that did not otherwise have formal relationships with each other. Countries whose governments did not speak directly had both made deposits. Their seeds sat in adjacent boxes on the same metal shelving, in the same cold room, in the same mountain. The seeds did not know this. The scientists who managed the deposits noted it, quietly, without making a large point of it. The vault had become, in the specific way that very practical things sometimes become, a rare piece of common ground. Eric thought about this sometimes, about what it meant that the only institution on Earth holding contributions from virtually every nation, without exception and without condition, was a cold room in an Arctic mountain built to outlast all of them. There is a tradition in seed banking called the Black Box Agreement. When a nation deposits seeds in the vault, the agreement is structured so that the depositing country retains full ownership of its seeds. The vault holds them in trust. The country can retrieve them at any time, for any reason without explanation. In 2015, Syria did exactly that. The International Center for Agricultural Research in the dry areas had maintained a gene bank in Aleppo, one of the most important collections of Near Eastern dryland crop varieties in the world. As the Syrian civil war made Aleppo increasingly dangerous, the center had been evacuated to Morocco and Lebanon. The seeds themselves, the physical backup of the collection, were in Svalbard. The center requested a withdrawal. The seeds were retrieved from the vault, checked, verified, and sent to the new facilities in Morocco and Lebanon. The gene bank was reconstituted. It was the first withdrawal in the vault's history. Eric heard about it on the news, the way most people did. He was sitting in his kitchen in Oslo having coffee. He sat with the news for a moment. The thing they had built had done the thing it was built to do. Not for a hypothetical future disaster, for a real one. For a country mid-crisis. For a gene bank mid-evacuation. For seeds that represented thousands of years of agricultural development in one of the oldest farming regions on Earth. He finished his coffee. He went to work. He retired in 2023. He was 63 years old. At his retirement dinner, attended by colleagues from 30 years of projects in difficult places, someone asked him which project he was most proud of. He thought about it. The question was not difficult in the way the person asking it probably thought. He did not have to weigh the projects against each other. He knew the answer. The vault, he said. Someone asked why. Was it the technical challenge? The location? The scale of what it would eventually hold? He shook his head. Because of what it says, he said. Every other thing I've built was built with the assumption that the world would continue. Roads, bridges, tunnels. You build them because you expect people to use them. The vault is built on a different assumption. It's built on the assumption that things might go very wrong, that the systems we depend on might fail, that what we know about how to feed ourselves might be lost. He paused. And it's built anyway, despite that assumption, because of that assumption. Someone decided that the right response to the possibility of catastrophe was not to be paralyzed by it, but to build something that would still be standing when whatever happened was over. He looked at his coffee. I find that hopeful, he said. Not hopeful in a naive way. Hopeful in the way that people are hopeful when they plant a tree they know they won't live to sit under. The room was quiet. Someone refilled his glass. The dinner continued. The vault is open now. It has always been open. Not to tourists. It is not a place you can visit on a whim, though occasional carefully managed tours have been organized for scientists and policymakers and journalists whose accounts of the experience share a consistent quality. They describe standing in the tunnel, in the cold, in the silence, and feeling something that is difficult to name, and that is, in most accounts, described as the opposite of dread, not hope exactly. Something quieter than hope. Something that feels more like the satisfaction of a problem considered carefully and addressed honestly. The satisfaction of knowing that somewhere in the world, in a cold room, in a mountain, on an island at the top of the world, the knowledge of how to feed ourselves is being kept safe by the cold and the stone, and the long, patient permanence of the Arctic. Outside the vault, the polar bears move across the snow. Inside, the seeds wait. They have been waiting since the first farmers noticed that the best plants from this year's harvest could become next year's seed. Since the first person understood that the future could be shaped by what you chose to save. They will keep waiting for however long is necessary, for whoever comes next, whatever you carry into tomorrow. Someone before you carried it too, and someone before them. That's how things survive. Rest now. The seeds are keeping watch.